Welcome back to M's Shinto lecture series. This week we'll be talking about folk religion and about new religions, both of which are not exclusively Shinto but have quite a lot to do with Shinto, as we will see. So first of all, we have to answer the question, what is folk religion? And this involves going back into the history of folklore studies. So folklore as a field and indeed as a term first originates in the 19th century. And at the time, folk were seen as the common people, and this generally meant peasants, farmers, the lower classes, many of whom were illiterate at the time. And that's why early folklore focuses on oral culture. This includes stories, various traditions and practices, culture in general. And that's why one of the most common associations with folklore is folk tales. So if you think back to the Brothers Grimm, that we can thank their informants for stories like Hansel and Gretel, Cinderella, etc. Their concern was collecting the folk tales of the Germanic folk. They grew up in Germany. And so again, there's this idea of sort of gathering all of these traditions in literate form because they hadn't been documented before. So folklore study still exists today, but has a quite different concept of what the folk is. So now the definition of folk in folklore studies is pretty much any social group that has a shared identity and distinctive traditions. So this could be even a family group with their own traditions. It could be fans of a particular sports team. And of course, it could also have to do with religion. So folklore studies, you won't often see it as a separate field in particular academic institutions, although there are a couple, but it's studied both within the humanities, you can imagine within English or literature, looking at folk tales, or folk religion within religious studies departments, and then also in the social sciences, most notably in anthropology. So what does this mean in terms of folk religion? Again, religion of the folk, but you'll also see the term popular religion used very commonly. And so what do both of these terms mean? They're not exactly the same thing, but they refer to forms of religion and various expressions, practices, customs associated with religion that are distinct from organized religion, right? So here we're not talking about Buddhism, Catholicism, Shinto as a whole, but rather popular expressions of it. And while not limited to these categories, these are things that we tend to see among particular ethnicities, particular regions, and occasionally among class lines, right? A particular class, and as you can imagine, usually not the elite. And they're often syncretic. This is no surprise when it comes to Japan, but it's important to remember this for folk religion overall. Many folk religions could be a hybrid of a mainstream religion like Christianity or Buddhism with more localized practices, or could combine several different religious traditions into one, maybe not exactly cohesive, but into a distinct tradition. Okay, moving to folk religion in Japan. One idea I wanted to point out was this concept of common religion, which was proposed by two scholars, George Tanabe and Ian Reader. And if that name looks familiar, it's the author of one of your textbooks. And basically their idea is that you have a common religious framework in Japan where you have shared beliefs, customs, practices, ways of thinking about the sort of spiritual world, afterlife, powers that be, that go across class lines and regions within Japan. And this book that they wrote about it is called Practically Religious because it does focus on the this-worldly orientation that we've come to know in Japan from Shinto, but essentially that the common religion in Japan does have a lot to do with practical benefits that you can get from a spirit world that comprises both kami, Buddhist deities, and indeed other spirits. And so the implication here is that this isn't just, sort of a regional group or a religion on the side, but is actually the default religion of Japan. Most people in Japan today, as we've talked about, consider themselves a-religious, but they kind of participate in this so-called common religion. So there's a lot of merit to this idea. I don't necessarily like how it sounds personally, but I think it's worth keeping in mind as we do consider folk religion. So in terms of other ideas ideas of what constitutes folk religion and what is, sort of studied as such within scholarship on Japan, there are a few things. One is Shugendo, which is a very syncretic mountain religion, and it focuses on ascetic practices that have a lot to do with Buddhism, but you'll definitely see an appreciation for nature and kami that come from Shinto as well. There's also a long history in Japan of families that have specific affinities or a specific relationship with a particular animal spirit, the most common of which are, unsurprisingly perhaps, foxes, snakes, and dogs. So this is also a very regional tradition that is certainly dying out, but the idea is this would be passed down within a family line, and that other families that also were related to foxes would sort of marry in with each other and continue this tradition. Sort of the biggest one in some ways is the various shamanic practices throughout Japan, which do tend to be very regional and also extremely syncretic in nature. And then there's a question of whether you would put the new religious movements in here, and that's something I'd like us to think about a little more before firmly deciding, but I'll just note here that there's scholarly debate on whether that's a legitimate way to interpret folk religion. So considering folk religion in Japan today, a few different things. We certainly see a continuation of syncretism in terms of what these various traditions are doing. And as you will find, no doubt, quite unsurprising, many of the forms of folk religion that were studied and have been studied over the past century or so have been greatly impacted by modernization in general, but also negatively impacted by various forms of repression under Imperial Japan, right? When syncretic religions were downplayed and various practitioners had to choose between Shinto and Buddhism in particular. So that means that quite a lot of these traditions are dying out. This is certainly true of shamanism, but you also have some that are undergoing revivals. And again, a notable one here is Shugendo, which is an extremely vibrant tradition today and a little more inclusive than it was in the past. So one particular folk religious practice I'd like to highlight is the itako. So the itako are shamans, and they communicate with dead spirits. That's their specialty. There are other shamanic groups in northern Japan who do this, but the itako are in some ways the most famous. Another distinctive characteristic is that they are blind, some of them simply visually impaired, and they're all women. And again, that's something you kind of see throughout shamanic traditions in Japan, that they are predominantly women. So these women undergo a very strict initiation process during their youth. Traditionally, it was before they got their periods, so at a prepubescent age. And this would, again, if we think more historically, this was something that, you weren't sort of called into shamanism as much as there were blind women, and, thinking about in especially poorer communities, how these women could be economically viable. It was essentially a profession reserved for them, likely because since they were blind, they were thought to, be able to see the spirit world more effectively than those of us who are sighted. And this is, again, syncretic tradition. The tutelary deity of a particular itako, which is sort of chosen during her initiation trance and ritual, could either be a kami or a Buddhist deity, whether a Buddha or a bodhisattva. And so the itako are specific to a place called Mount Osore, which is at the very top of Honshu, the main island of Japan. And Osore literally means fear, and that's because this is a volcanic mountain said to resemble various Buddhist hells. You can indeed take a tour of all the Buddhist hells on Osore, which, again, because it's volcanic, this makes some sense, but it's also a particularly sparse landscape, as you see here. So few itako remain today, and there are two primary reasons for this. One is that you have fewer childhood diseases resulting in blindness, right? It's not quite as common anymore. We don't have things like scarlet fever, of which a potential side effect was lifelong blindness. So that's less of a problem in a way, and then you just have declining interest. Although again, if you look at this image at the top where people are lining up to consult itako and commune with their dead ancestors, it does still have a certain amount of interest today. Okay, shifting gears to talk about new religious movements, and here too I'm going to talk about them in general before we talk about the case of Japan. So, as the name suggests, this is a religious or spiritual group with relatively modern origins, right? It's very much associated with the issue of modernization, right? So you really don't see these before the 1800s, most of them from the late 1800s, because they're thought to be in some ways a response to industrialization, urbanization, a lot of the particular challenges that modernization has posed to societies around the world. So many of them draw from older religious traditions, but some are completely novel, right? So some of them draw specifically from Christianity, from Buddhism, from Shinto, but some of them are completely new. And those that do draw from older religious traditions are often persecuted or, sort of discriminated against as being deviant, as not, sort of upholding the actual traditions of the main organized religion. So because of this, some of them can be classified as sects, or again, breakaway groups from a larger religious tradition. Some can also be classified as cults, usually the ones that are completely novel in some way, but we'll also talk a little bit more about the difference between a sect and a cult, used both in sociology and in religious studies. Those that are considered cults do often feature a charismatic leader and a high degree of group conformity, which again are things associated with cults. So the demographic is usually first-generation believers, people who have converted to these new religious movements, especially when they were brand new. We do have second and third-generation believers in some today, but still the overall demographic is relatively young. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. You don't see it just in Japan, and it's the subject of a lot of debate because it's really hard to determine what exactly constitutes a new religious movement. There are a lot of different definitions of what these can and cannot be, classifications, and thus, again, it's really hard to determine which religious groups technically count as a new religious movement. Do you include the Latter-day Saints or Mormonism, for instance? Do you include the Hare Krishna or ISKCON? And in many cases, yes, but again, it very much depends on how exactly you define these. Moving to the case of Japanese new religions, it's worth noting that this is a term used in Japanese as well. Shinshukyo literally means new religions, and they first emerge in the late 1800s, most of them right at the beginning of the Meiji period. At first, at least. And these early new religions were specifically derived from Shinto and sometimes from regional shamanic practices. Later on, in the earliest 20th century, especially around the 1920s and 30s, you start to see more new religious groups that are coming from Buddhist traditions, and some of those are among the most popular today. You also have another category in Japan that you don't see elsewhere necessarily, and that is the new religions. And again, this term is replicated in Japanese with the Shinshukyo. And these are ones that emerge after World War II, so any that emerge after 1945. And it's important to note that these are either new religions that are founded in Japan or that are brought in after 1945. So for example, in the Japanese context, the Jehovah's Witnesses, which do have a presence in Japan, they're considered new religions, even though the Jehovah's Witnesses actually emerged in the 1870s. Another important aspect, somewhat specific to Japanese new religions, is that women have played a key role, first as founders in some of the earliest new religions, but also as proselytizers and lay teachers in both new and new religions today. So in terms of the women as founders, we could consider this maybe to be a throwback to the role of early Miko and other shamanic women. Again, most shamanic traditions in Japan are predominantly filled by women. We might also consider that new religious movements provide roles for women that organized religions don't, right? Women can be Shinto priests, they can be Buddhist priests, but it's very rare. Whereas in the case where you have lay teachers, where you don't require anyone to sort of leave their family or undergo a firm amount of training, you create a role for lay women to be, sort of teachers and guides in a new way. That said, many of the new religious movements, even those founded by women, have very clearly misogynistic ideas, or at least ideas of sort of gender separation or gender complementarity, that men and women have very different roles in society, and those distinctions should be respected. And so this is an issue of much, sort of debate and interest among scholars in Japan today. So the most popular Japanese new religious movement by far is Soka Gakkai, sometimes Soka Gakkai International, which has Buddhist origins, although many of the ones with Shinto origins remain popular today, and you'll be looking at that in group work on Friday. However, there has been a bit of a backlash against new religions, and that's primarily due to the activities of one specific new religion called Tenrikyō that conducted the Tokyo subway sarin gas attacks in 1995, in which a number of people died and several thousand were greatly injured. So this has sort of led to a movement against these new religions, stigmatizing them as cults, which Shinrikyo definitely was, but not all of them are. So you definitely see this tension still today. So I wanted to focus on a specific new religion called Tenrikyō that is derived from Shinto, or is considered to be a Shinto new religion. So it was founded by Nakayama Miki, who was from a peasant background but a relatively wealthy one, and lived predominantly during the Edo period, but just verging into Meiji at the end there. So when she was about 40, Miki experienced a divine revelation from the Kami Tenri. And if you've never heard of the Kami Tenri, that's fine, because it didn't really exist before Miki's revelation. And according to Miki, the Tenri was the single creator god of all creation, and sort of functions as a parent, whereas Miki was not only his main communicator, but his shrine on earth. She essentially considered herself a shrine to Tenri. And so Miki's revelations from Tenri, the various poems she wrote about Tenri and about spiritual life, as well as instructions for Kagura, again an adaptation from the sacred dance of Shinto, to a specific divine dance that's still performed in Tenrikyō today. All of the texts she left behind are considered sacred texts. I've even seen them translated as scriptures. And even though it is primarily a Shinto new religion, there is a concept of causality developed within Tenrikyō that really clearly draws quite a lot on karma. So it's still syncretic in its own way. And Tenrikyō continues to be very popular in Japan. You see here the Tenrikyō headquarters are in a place called Tenri that is named after the religion. It doesn't predate the new religion. And there's also headquarters of the North American branch of Tenrikyō in Los Angeles. So again, it has a strong presence still today. Okay, so materials for the week having to do with both folk religion and new religion. So on Monday, you'll read about folk religion in a very famous book on the subject for Japan. Because it's an older book, I've been able to find the whole PDF. So please, take a look and pick a particular chapter that interests you. And just a reminder that it was written in the late 60s. So some of the language, some of the ideas about folk religion are somewhat predated, or somewhat dated. You'll hear a lot of terms like primitive, for example, or the noumena. So just bear with that. On Thursday, you'll have another chapter from Shinto Simple Guides, which we haven't read in quite a while, but it talks about, sort of Shinto today and about these new religions. But a more detailed guide to new religions in Japan is also, we're also going to read on Thursday. And finally, on Friday, you'll read about your particular group's new religious movement. So again, I'll get the, sort of possibilities and group assignments up a lot earlier. You'll have a video on the Yamabushido, which is very much like a Shugendo. Again, these practitioners of ascetic practices in the mountains in Japan. I specifically didn't do any videos on new religions, partially because I couldn't find a really solid one that I felt comfortable using, but also because I think you'll find a number of them in the course of looking at individual new religions. And finally, in terms of discussion questions, I want to think about, again, folk religions and new religions together. What characteristics do these two type of religions share? But then how do they differ? Is, I think, very much worth thinking about. In terms of the Japanese new religions, how do they compare to other new religious movements that you know about? It could be worth taking a quick look at the list of new religious movements on Wikipedia. It's quite long, but you'll see quite a variety of religious practices on there. So I think this is worth considering, again, Japanese new religions in the larger worldwide context. And finally, what is the appeal of both of these types of religions today? Why are some people turning back to folk religions? Why are there revival movements? Why are some of them lingering on? And why are there so many new religions, and how are they doing so well in a culture that's generally considered to be largely a-religious? All right, thanks so much, and I'll see you in class on Thursday.